If you're from another core office, they'll be sharing the same information. So we're really good at doing that. Let me move you guys around and then, okay. So today during this session, we're going to be looking at the Tennessee Math Instructional Practice Guide, which we call the IPG, and giving you some ideas for supports on how to implement using the IPG. I know one of you already did it, but if you could just take a moment to put your name, your role, and your district in the chat just to see who's in the room, I'd really appreciate it if you do that really quickly. And I guess you did that. I can't see the chat, which is fine. Michael, am I still here? Am I still good?
Yep, you're still good.
Okay, good. All right, perfect. Yeah, yep. I see Robbie and some other people. Awesome. So the instructional practice guides, first we're going to discuss them, the purpose of the IPGs. Tools like the IPG are important for several reasons. One being that we always want to build a culture of continuous learning for all educators, regardless of what role you hold. Like the quote says, when teachers stop learning, so do students. We know that when we continue to learn about better ways that students learn and analyze data for what is effective, we can help our students grow. And instilling this mindset in teachers helps to create a pathway to a positive mindset driven to never stop learning how to be better for students and keeping students at the center always. Instructional practice guides define the vision for strong instruction. Although it's typically used in core instruction, the indicators are important for any type of instruction that students receive, even if they receive instruction in other settings. We know that strong core instruction is inclusive of all learners. That means it not only gives all students access to grade level content, but also leverages high quality instructional materials in a way that provides access points to support all learners' engagement in grade level instruction. If you recall in your fall session, you were introduced to two IPG tools for ELA. One was for foundational skills that's used for grades pre-K to 2, and the other one is for building knowledge that is used for pre-K to 12. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of the Tennessee Instructional Practice Guide for Mathematics. The great news is there's only one, and it can be used K-12. It's important for leaders to use the IPG in various ways, norming on what strong instructional practices look like and sound like. When we norm on our expectations, it allows us to use the IPG as a tool during learning walks to have high quality discussions on the instruction that is viewed focusing on strengths and areas of growth to drive toward continuous improvement. And the information gleaned from learning walks using the IPG can and should provide teacher with quality feedback for next steps to improve instruction and positive feedback for what to continue. The IPG should be considered as part of the intellectual prep cycle when you're doing lesson prep, unit prep, analyzing student work, IPG walks, giving feedback, so forth and so on. Additional considerations regarding using the IPG is that some teachers don't necessarily have knowledge or understanding of what this IPG is. Some might not. And then school and district leaders' use of the IPGs to guide instructional feedback varies across the state. And then specialty teachers like special ed teachers or E&L teachers may not be as familiar with the tool as general educators if they are familiar with it. So just keep that in mind as you consider using the IPG. Again, as you learned earlier this year, the Tennessee Department of Education has two tools to support the vision for strong literacy instruction. Although the math tool is slightly different, each IPG mirrors one another in focus. So we have the culture of learning, the use of high quality instructional materials, teacher actions or teacher moves, including questioning, modeling, and then student actions or engagement, student practice, things like that. Today, I'm going to orient you to the Tennessee Tool for Mathematics and talk about the high-level indicators of effective mathematics instruction. We're not going to go through every indicator in detail today, as the purpose of this session is not to norm you on using the tool, but to give you a general sense of what strong mathematics instruction looks like so that you can develop your own vision of excellent instruction and support others to be able to realize your vision of strong instruction. So again, we're looking at the Tennessee Instructional Practice Guide for Mathematics. But before we do that, I would love to get an idea of how familiar you are with using the Tennessee Math IPG. From A, hardly familiar at all, B, vaguely or a little bit familiar, C, generally you're pretty familiar, or D, you are got it, you're well-versed in practice in the IPG. If you would just drop that in the chat real quick, just to see where we are with the level of understanding about the IPG. Great. And then, Michael, can you drop the IPG into the chat for us?
I did. I went ahead and did it.
Okay, great. So if you would reference the one that he put in the chat, or you might have a paper copy, that would be great, because now we're going to look at different components of the IPG. And we're just going to take a closer look at those. So as you likely noticed, the tool is structured as a hierarchy such that more foundational elements generally come first. So first, you're going to really check that kids are actually doing what's being asked of them, the culture. And then you check that what is being asked of them is appropriate. Is the content or grade level appropriate? Are the tasks appropriately challenging? Are they standards aligned? That's core action 1. And then, are students doing most of the work, doing the thinking in the class? That's core action 3. And core action 2 is where the teachers really help develop math meaning and strategies that they use. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the culture indicators in that top bucket. And this is the question is there a classroom culture where student agency, mathematical identity, and belonging contribute to students' mathematical success? I'm going to give you 1 minute to read through just this bucket of culture of learning and those 4 parts of that. So go ahead and do that now. Annotate it, think about it. Go ahead and do that. About 10 more seconds. Great, thanks so much. So I want to call out here that culture or environment and culture of learning should be viewed differently. The culture of learning is specifically calling out the academic environment that not only prioritizes each student's learning experience, but also ensures that the time spent throughout the lesson is well organized and that the time spent is in the most meaningful way to help all students stay engaged in this learning and to be successful. Expectations here is an important consideration. When you are engaged in learning walks and evaluating the culture of learning, it's important to ask if high expectations are expected of all students and if the culture of learning creates an environment where this is possible, not just some students. So again, those 4 components of culture of learning, just thinking about what that might look like in your schools, in your district. All right, now we're going to look at core action 1. Remember that the IPG is structured as a hierarchy such that more foundational elements generally come first. So First, you check that kids are actually doing what is being asked of them. Then you check that what is being asked of them is appropriate. This work begins with the core action investigating the content put before students. So take 1 minute to read and annotate core action 1 only. When you're ready, drop a line in the chat box to answer either of these questions. What stands out to you about this domain? Or what questions do you have about this domain? And I think Michael's going to drop those in the chat for us. Go ahead and do that now. About 10 more seconds to think about core action 1.
Looks like we're getting a couple responses in the chat, so I'll read them as they come out.
Great, thank you.
Let's see. Robbie says requires on grade level instruction and use of HQIMs. Sherry says on grade level appreciate rigor and appropriate rigor, and coherence. And Rhonda says 1A majority spent on grade level content.
Yeah, so great job, team. Core action 1 calls out the use of HQIM as the center of the instruction in service of developing mathematical ideas and rigorous instruction. Here we're considering if students have spent most of their time in grade level content and they think that was a trend in the responses, so good job. We also want to take note of the standards of the lesson and ensure the content is aligned to grade level standards and at the level of rigor for the grade at this particular point in the year. It's so important in many ways, including the assurance that students are being taught using appropriate materials aligned to the expectations of their grade level with a clear focus on students drawing on prior learning and experiences to make connections and develop mathematical understanding. A common misstep is that just having the materials out is not an automatic yes for core action 1. Instead, consideration should be given to how the materials are being leveraged as designed to connect mathematical ideas and address the appropriate aspect of rigor called for by the standards, whether it's conceptual understanding or application. For this reason, it should be difficult to rate core action 1 without properly reviewing your HQIM to develop an understanding of what as designed means for the particular lesson. So that leads us to the Tennessee Instructional Focus Documents, or IFDs. These serve as an excellent resource for both teachers and leaders in understanding the focus and intent of the Tennessee math standards. These can be found on the Best for All Central by grade or course. So let me go ahead and go to this slide. Oh, I got to finish this slide first. So how familiar are you with the IFDs? Is there anybody who'd like to share how you've seen these in your district or use these? You can come off mute. If not, it's all good.
I've also, just so you know, I've dropped the link into the chat with the IFDs.
Wonderful. Awesome. And personally, as a former math teacher, math coach, and math lead in my district where I came from, this is one of the best things the State Department has ever done because it really tells us exactly what the standards are. And the example I like to use is, let's say I'm supposed to teach Pythagorean theorem. Well, that's a squared plus c squared equals a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, that's great, but is that what the expectations are for the Pythagorean theorem at that grade level. So it's not just being familiar with the content, but it's being familiar with the depth and rigor of the standards. And that's so important. And again, at the bottom, it talks about the progressions and the visual models if they're supposed to be used. And also just pointing out up here, again, this chart tells you whether it should be conceptual understanding, procedure and fluency, or application. And all of that is very, very, very important for math teachers to understand. So just
Rhonda
to
said,
get, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Rhonda says that she agrees with your statement. It's the best thing ever done. And I think I've got another line coming in real quick from Robbie.
Love that. Thank you, Rhonda. And Robbie?
Let's see here. It says IFDs have been a great tool in planning and preparation. As an observer, they help me understand the grade level standards being taught.
Yes, and they should be right along there with your HQIM. Standards are what we teach. HQIM is the way that we're going to teach that. So awesome. Great job, leaders. So most leaders have shared with me that they like to bookmark this page on the Best for All Central or download the PDF versions on their iPad or laptop for easy access. I personally like to have this last link where it says combined. So I can just do a Control F keyword search for a grade or words, and it'll just take me there in the document. So again, you've already talked about how you've seen IFDs with HQIM, and hopefully during walks, that will help you gain insight into what's being implemented. Again, it's not what we think the standard should be. It's what the state says the standard should be at that level. So I'm so glad you're, yeah.
And Rhonda also says, also using it in, I believe, in tier instruction. Rhonda, if you want to come off mute and kind of explain it a little bit more, you can.
Be great.
We like to use it, of course, at 3. We're at standard. So for those enrichment kids, looking at level 4, and for intervention kids, where they've fallen, using their student work to see where they're falling on the IFD. If they're at that level 2, what can I do to move them to level 3? That way.
100%. Love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's great insight. How they progress along that trajectory of level 1 to, of course, tier 1's 3, and then or 4, right? We can push those higher kids. Awesome. Thank you, Rhonda, for sharing. All right. So let's go on to core action 2. We want to hone in on the intentionality of teacher moves around questions and tasks. So take 1 minute to highlight or annotate crucial parts of core action 2. Go ahead and do that now. About 10 more seconds. Great. With core action 2, we're looking at the instructional strategies the teacher is using that support students' progress through the lesson to mastery of learning. Big picture is you are looking to see the teacher is using the materials and craft in a way that allows all students the opportunity to interact and explore mathematics, to connect to and make meaning out of what they're learning. The emphasis here on variety and multiple and student work and adjustments is intentional. In other words, this core action is chock full of formative assessment moments that allows the teachers to know if his or her students are with them and which specific strengths or bright spots and or misconceptions are surfacing. Notice on indicator D, the emphasis on student work, questions, and discussions. Strong evidence of core action 2 will have classrooms where teachers are prompting students to talk to one another about what they are learning. This not only allows students the opportunity to learn from one another, but also allows the teacher an opportunity to listen to what their students are saying and adjust or highlight student thinking accordingly. Your HQIM are designed with intentional question sequences to support teachers in creating these types of learning environments. Simply review the margins of any TE for this wraparound support and you'll see. Also notice here that Core Action 2 starts this idea of 4 different categories. This yes and mostly we call an upper bucket, somewhat not yet we call a lower bucket. And so it just gives us an idea of like, maybe we're in the lower bucket. What could we do to help teachers move to that upper bucket so that we have more yes or mostly in these categories? So just know that's a little different from culture and Core Action 1. All right, moving on to Core Action 3. As we move to Core Action 3, we will focus on the inherent connection between teacher moves and the subsequent impact those moves have on student behaviors. At the heart of Core Action 3, we want to see that all students have the opportunity to do mathematical thinking within the lesson, not just perform mathematics. So take 1 minute to read and annotate Core Action 3. Make note of some specific student actions you would want to see in a classroom. About 10 more seconds. Great, thanks so much. So in Core Action 3, we move to a focus on student engagement. Some questions to consider here are, who is carrying the cognitive lift in the classroom? Is time provided to allow students to grapple with the mathematics? Are all students engaged? If not, which students are not actively engaged? Are there any trends you're noticing on who is or who is not engaged? Are students provided the opportunity to talk to each other, to learn from each other? Do all students take advantage of this opportunity to converse with their peers? Or do their discussions go beyond just sharing answers? And just a note here, I've spent a lot of time in high school math classes lately. And just, I think one thing I really work with teachers on is we need to teach students how to talk to each other and talk to each other about the math. Because as we know, there's devices that kind of keep them from engaging with each other and communicating. So if you have to take time to teach students how to talk to each other, that's okay. We can do that as teachers. And then just going back to the ELA IPG tool, you may recall from an earlier session that ELA has added the new Core Action 4. This is in the beta phase of implementation, and the Tennessee Math IPG tool does not yet have a Core Action 4. However, we are interested in aligning the tools as feedback comes from districts who are engaging in this work with the core ELA and SPED consultants in the Access for All. So just know, I know a lot of districts are already marrying those two because we want all students to have access, but it's not part of the Math IPG as of yet.
So Sheila, got a couple of answers that just came into the chat tied to Core Action 3. So Rhonda writes, productive struggle, multiple learning paths, students explaining their thinking. And Robbie writes, peer-to-peer feedback and questioning, showing their work in different ways. I think those are the things that they said they would look for in a classroom to kind of illustrate that.
Yeah, and that multiple representations in different ways in student works, a lot of that's going to come down to prep because most math teachers learn to do something one way. They may not know there's different ways to do it, but your HQI and materials will have multiple pathways and multiple representations in there. Again, using those teachers editions, you can help teachers look for and learn how to do the math different ways. Thank you. That's great. You guys are on top of it today. All right. So while the Math IPG does not yet call for Core Action 4, it's certainly a place where the heart behind ensuring access for all students is alive and well. So just looking at this list, you've already mentioned a couple of them. This list is not exhaustive, but here are some ideas of what look for is that you might expect to see when observing or conducting learning walks that effectively support students with disabilities, English language learners, economically disadvantaged, and really all students who may be in need of support with grade level materials. Our goal is to use our on grade level material and through questioning, tasks, conversations, we really want students to own their learning and to be able to share what sense they're making of the math. Remembering that these supports should not be provided for every student, but for those who may need temporary support to access the on grade level task. So just take a minute and look through here. Again, I think you've already mentioned some of these, but just thinking through what this could look like in your district and your schools and what this might mean and implications for you as you can move forward with the Math IPG. And I will say this too, in the work that I've done with a lot of districts, teachers, especially secondary teachers, get a little nervous about letting go and letting students do the talking and the lifting. And so it might be that we encourage teachers to take that risk. And that might be that maybe an instructional coach or you as an instructional leader comes alongside them and say, let's just try having kids talk about this right here. Let's just try and share some different work samples from different students. So sometimes that's hard for teachers to do because they like to have control and they're thinking about discipline and what if they don't talk about what they're supposed to talk about. But that's where we just want them to be risk takers and jump in and think about what's really good for students to help all students access the material. Because I assure you, I don't want to share my thinking until I've at least talked to one other person about my thinking and cleared it up. And we want students doing those same things. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just some ideas of what you can look for so that you know all students are looking for multiple ways to access the math.
And Sheila Sherry shares that sentiment. She says middle school teachers are the same. So
Oh, I was one, girl. I was one. Yes, that those secondary teachers, 612, I'm telling you. That's a great point. All right. So now that we've looked at the IPG, we really want to think about how great lessons are connected to solid lesson preparation. Here we'll take a moment to show how Core Action 2 is connected to intellectual prep, keeping in mind leaders can and must help teachers know and understand the intellectual prep process. So read the statement in column 1. Core Action 2. So thinking about this variety of explanations, tasks, instructional technique, what do teachers need to do to prepare for this core action in the practice? Take a minute to think about that. And you might drop it in the chat, Michael, if you just would monitor that. What will teachers need to do to get to the depth of this core action to a yes?
Stephanie says dig into their IFDs to really prepare for it.
100%.
Sherry says teachers need to know the content and their students. Rhonda, instructional techniques, explicit teaching, internal summaries, providing lots of feedback.
Wonderful. Great. Yeah, so they really need to do the pre-work. Teachers must be familiar with the gist of the lesson and what students will be asked to do. I relate this to ELA. If I'm going to go teach an ELA lesson about a certain text, I'm going to read the text before I go in and teach that lesson. I'm going to annotate it. I'm going to think through my questioning. It's the same thing with math. We want math teachers to do the work of the student for that day and the task that we're asking them to do. Work through it. Look at multiple strategies. Grapple with the questions. Think where students might struggle. Ensure how to meet those, to break down those barriers where they might struggle. And again, exactly, leading into the HQIM and the experience of peers for that student exploration and discourse. What do I want to have them talk about? What's that going to sound like? So just thinking about, here are some ideas. Let me advance this forward, if it'll go forward. So just thinking about what teachers need to do in intellectual prep to be able to reach a yes on that core action 2. It's all about the planning, and we know that as instructional leaders. So we can wrap this section up with the thought, strong teaching requires strong preparation. So now that we've looked at the IPG and connected it a bit to planning, let's consider how a learning walk might look when using the Tennessee Math IPG. Just as our teachers must prepare for each lesson, we too need to be prepared before we head into the classroom. So before the walks, leaders should closely review the lesson materials and IFDs, identifying the big understanding of the lesson and how this lesson fits into the unit, including what the summative assessment might be. What are some checks for understanding for this lesson? So this slide includes some high-level questions for each section of the IPG that leaders can consider as they conduct a learning walk. These questions are also helpful for teachers so they're aware of what their school leaders and coaches will be looking for during a classroom learning walk. What are you looking for when you come into my classroom? So just take a minute to read through these italicized questions and see if those resonate with you. And I love that most of these are the same thing with ELA, science, social studies, like good instruction is good instruction. Good strategies are good strategies. So as you are, if you're a generalist instructional leader, then I love that we can make connections with that and not have to think about this as another thing. It's just like what the work that we're already doing in other subjects. So that's really thinking through and planning for the walks. So during the walks, you're going to want to take note of what you see. You're going to want to record your wonderings, your questions that you might have about the lesson, and connect your questions and noticing to the IPG indicators. These notes will be beneficial when debriefing with your learning walk team and or the teacher once the learning walk is complete. So many have noted, we know that there's little space on the actual IPG to take quality notes. So feel free to adapt to your preference using pencil and paper, a notebook for learning walks, your laptop. I like to turn the IPG over and just take notes for that classroom on that tool. It's important to always have a copy of the IPG in hand to reference throughout every learning walk, regardless of how you take notes. And then after the walks, now that they're over, you want to debrief with your team. This can look different based on the number of classrooms you visit on that day. For example, you might want to go to 2 first grade classrooms and talk about them with your team after each class. Or you might want to go to the 2 and then talk to each other. And then debrief at the end. You just choose a method that works for your team. When considering what to discuss, you can consider an overarching question. Where does your teacher feedback need to focus? Keep in mind that in providing feedback to teachers, you'll want to focus on the one thing that will have the greatest impact on student learning. After thinking through and discussing the learning walk with your team, should your actionable steps focus on improving teacher moves or improving intellectual prep. Also consider how intellectual prep impacts and drives high academic expectations as represented in the core actions for all students. As we saw earlier, everyone can benefit from using this tool in a variety of ways. Leaders must develop a time to strengthen these practices among other leaders, all staff that serve students and teachers, including professional learning and dedicated time for intellectual prep to allow for effective collaboration, data analysis, student work analysis, and reflection using targeted feedback from learning walks, driving back to intellectual prep. So just wrapping up this section, are there any questions before I just share a couple of other opportunities you have for upcoming learning in math? Any questions, Michael, in the chat, or come off mute? Y'all are so well versed in the IPG. I feel it. I just feel a trend in the room, which is great. Awesome. So just sharing a couple of upcoming resources for you as leaders. The Intellectual Prep Hub, there's a link here to that. The Math Standards resource page, we already showed that you. And then the Math Implementation Network, some of you have been a part of that. We already had one asynchronous lesson, one virtual session with that. So additionally, district leaders are supported by the regional core consultants like me, who work alongside district leaders to meet the goals you have in your LEA plan. And then here's some specific resources again from the department. If you haven't